Call to order the special meeting of the West Basin Municipal Water District. With that, Mr. General Manager, we have a determination of.
Yes, Mr. President. Director Scott Houston. Here. Director Don Deere. Here. Director Gloria Gray.
Here.
President Desi Alvarez.
Here.
Yeah.
Next item is public comment. Do we have any public comment, Mr. General Manager?
President Alvarez, we do not have any requests for public comment for today's meeting that were made prior to the meeting, though this meeting is being held both in person and virtually. If there's any member of the public that would like to make public comment, please indicate so by raising your virtual hand. And Mr. President, we do not have any requests.
Okay, then we will move on. And the next item up on the agenda is presentations. I don't think we have any today. So we will move on to the action calendar, and the first item up is the consideration for fiscal year 24-25 district sponsorship request. Mr. General Manager, please introduce that item.
Yes, thank you very much. This item does begin on packet page 3. We do have Carla Hewitt, our executive assistant, here for a presentation if desired, but I thought I would give you a brief overview. First, let me say I apologize for bringing this to a special board meeting. The reason for that was the request, though we knew may come, did not come until the new year. So looking at the schedule, a board meeting that we could bring it to, this was the first one. And we will be noting that our typical process would require a 10-day notice for us to approve a sponsorship like this. We will not have that 10 days, and that is the reason for the two-part recommendation. The Southern California Water Coalition has long been trying to host their board meeting and their, I believe it's a quarterly luncheon in the West Basin service area. They tried, and say Executive Director Charlie Wilson tried to secure the SoFi Stadium some time ago, and really it just was never able to be put together. Just in December, he contacted West Basin and requested some information about how to get in touch with the Intuit Dome. Our very own director, Gloria Gray, was able to put him in contact with them. And since that time, he's been working in coordination with the Intuit Dome to secure that as a location for their board meeting and luncheon. So we are there. Unfortunately, the cost was somewhat significant in comparison to what they would typically pay for a location. And with that, he has gone and asked for some of the local agencies to provide additional sponsorship. We were able to put them in touch with AECOM. AECOM did the design work there at Intuit Dome. You know that they do have on-site treatment of our recycled water, and they're a proud user of our recycled water there at the Dome. So we're excited to have that. The Southern California Water Coalition will be doing a tour of the facility and get to see not only the technology that they utilize in the Dome, but again, focus with our recycled water there. So with that, the executive director has asked if West Basin could provide that sponsorship of $3,000. It would provide West Basin a dedicated table. And of course, you know, their executive director, Charlie Wilson, he'll be recognizing West Basin there at that event. And so staff's recommendation is that the board consider waiving the 10-day requirement to submit sponsorship requests as it applies to the Southern California Water Coalition quarterly luncheon to be held on January 24th at the Intuit Dome. Secondly, the recommendation would be that the board consider approving the sponsorship of the Southern California Water Coalition quarterly luncheon. And again, he did request $3,000. And so again, we do have Carla Hewitt here. If you have any specific questions, I've provided the high overview, but if you want to get into some of the details, she'll probably be best to answer.
Would any board members like a more formal presentation, or do you think you have enough information to discuss this item and move on this item?
I'll move the recommendation.
I'll second it.
All right, so the answer to the first question is you do have enough information and you do not wish to have a formal presentation. And the answer to the question that was not asked was it to remove the item. Thank you. So, if there's any, for discussion, do we have any comments?
Mr. President,
Yes,
can you hear me?
Director Craig, go ahead.
Yes, thanks. To answer your first question, I don't need a presentation. I'm very much aware of the work the Water Coalition does. We have a representative as representing us as part of the Water Coalition, and he does play a leadership role there. And I do support the motion. I think they do a great job in our industry, making sure our messages are within the industry and in the public. So with that, I think we should move forward with the question. Thank you.
I do have a couple of questions. It's good to see the Southern California Water Coalition meeting in our service area. It's been a long time, I think, since they've met in the service area. Usually they meet in the Inland Empire, Orange County, and other places, which says quite a bit of a drive if you want to attend their meetings. So that's a good thing. In terms of the request for additional financial support, we have in the past and continue to support the Southern California Water Coalition. And I think that earlier this year, we've already supported and sponsored one event. Typically, when they have done this in other areas, have they needed additional financial, or have they received additional financial support from other local agencies to put together the luncheon? Because they do charge for the luncheon, and it's part of their general budget, I would assume.
I'm not aware of any requests such as this for some of their previous meetings. I would say that their goal is to host these meetings and the event at a location within their budget. The Intuit Dome is somewhat more significant than what they typically plan as far as location. Again, having spoken to the executive director, he did a site visit and was very impressed with everything that they were offering, but it does come at a far greater cost than their typical meeting at a hotel.
And did they request Intuit Dome to give them special rates?
They did request special rates, but Intuit Dome has
Intuit Dome, econ.
one rate. Yeah, Charlie did a great job of reaching out and coordinating with them. Again, he just did a site visit recently and came back very impressed. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I believe he feels that they're going to get the value out of what they're paying, but it is significantly more expensive than their typical event.
Do we know within the Southern California Water Coalition budget what their budget is? And I'm sure they have some reserves why they couldn't just go ahead, and if they, I think this is a very nice venue. I've never been to the Intuit Dome, so I'm looking forward to attending the luncheon so I can tour the Intuit Dome. But have they looked internally to say, yeah, this is something we'd like to afford our members, and therefore something we can go ahead and pay for?
I think they're always trying to find locations that offer something in addition to their meeting and to the event. I think in this case, it's showcasing a recycled water customer, and so there was kind of this added excitement for it. I don't know his typical budget, but I thought it was somewhere, and this is, our conversations. I thought the events and meetings cost approximately $35,000, and I believe that AECom is contributing $10,000. I don't know, Carla, if you have anything in addition.
Not about the cost of the day.
Or their budget and how much money they have sitting in the bank?
No, typically when we receive sponsorship proposals, we receive details on the package there is usually no financial information on the entities that are requesting provided along with their request.
Okay, I don't have any other questions. I think that it's a worthwhile luncheon, but I think that the Southern California Water Coalition should either increase their quarterly luncheon charge. I think it's, I don't know what it is per person, but they could ask for a little bit more, or look internally to finances. So I will not be supporting the motion, but we'll have a roll call.
Director Scott Houston,
Yes.
Director Don Deere,
Yes.
Director Gloria Gray,
Yes,
and President Desi Alvarez.
Okay, so moving on, we are here to consider a presentation on the cost of service analysis. And with that, Mr. General Manager, would you like to introduce the item?
Yes, thank you very much, President Alvarez. And let me say thank you to all of you, to each of you for joining us here today. The presentation that you're about to see has been a long work in progress. We were able to provide you updates throughout that process, but towards the end of 2024, we felt very confident in the completion of this project. The cost of service is something that we pointed out has really never been done here at West Basin, and partly because the cost of producing recycled water has evolved throughout our history with our Edwards E. Little Water Recycling Facility and the production of recycled water, the different types of customers, and of course, something we're very proud of, the 5 designer waters that we serve, basically fit for purpose for each of our customers. So the presentation that you're about to see is the work product of many people here at West Basin, as well as our outside consultants, Hazen and Sawyer. So I just wanted to quickly highlight just a few of those. Obviously, Barka Masurlian, our Executive Manager of Engineering Operations, Susanna Lee, our Manager of Engineering. You may recall Marianne Rexroad, our former CFO, Wendy Nakamura, former CFO, and then, of course, Joel Blair, who's now at the Water Replenishment District, Matt Vey, our Manager of Water Policy and Resources Development, and then, of course, one of our newer staff members, our Assistant General Manager, Eric Owens. And this is not a comprehensive list, just kind of trying to show some of the leadership that went into the work that you're about to see. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our Assistant General Manager, Eric Owens, for a presentation. It does begin on packet page 6.
Thank you, EJ. First, I'd like to just acknowledge that the title here is a bit of a misnomer. While it does say cost of service analysis, it should be clarified that this is a recycled water cost of service analysis, not a cost of service analysis for the entire district's finances. Can we go to the next slide? All right, we're going to spend a little bit of time upfront on some key definitions, reiterating the benefits of West Basin's recycled water program. As we start to get into the costs, we won't go into too much depth. There's an attached memo that can be read by anyone, and there's a lot of detail there. But I do think it's important to understand the methodology that was applied to this process, because we do have a very complex treatment system. You know, after 5 expansions at the Edward C. Little facility and construction of our satellite facilities, there's a lot of intermixing and intermingling of equipment at the facilities, and there is a lot of sharing between assets to our distinct water products, and so we'll try to detangle that a little bit in this presentation. And then, of course, we're going to talk about what we call volumetric costs, infrastructure costs. We'll get specifically into how the cost of service analysis, what it assumes and how it applies the calculation. And then we'll touch on what we're planning to do next with this information. And so if that, we could go to the next slide. All right, as I mentioned, I do want to spend a little bit of time on the benefits of recycled water. I know that the board hears this in virtually every presentation that we bring in front of the board talking about recycled water, but I do feel like in the context of the cost of recycled water, it's really important for us to to remind ourselves of what those benefits, both tangible and perhaps less tangible, are to not just West Basin as a whole, not just to our recycled water users, but to the region and to the communities that we serve. And so, as you see here, there's no particular order of importance, but some of these I think you've seen many, many times. Some of them may be relatively new, but let's just start at the top. The reality is that the use of recycled water does allow us to offset the use of imported water. By that we mean potable drinking water, and that allows that drinking water to be saved for other purposes such as human consumption. And this is, of course, particularly important in an arid region like Southern California, where we have a very dry climate to start with, let alone in the era of climate change and the variable climate. And so, again, I think this district has been very forward thinking in their investments in recycled water as it pertains to a second water supply that, in our case, is mostly a non-potable supply that offsets the use of potable drinking water. And that allows our communities to reserve that water for their drinking consumption. Recycled water also preserves the infrastructure. And so, it preserves that water for not just human consumption, but critical and essential uses. Not to belabor an issue that is currently on the top of everybody's minds, but I think the fires in the Palisades and elsewhere are certainly a good example where water availability was a critical issue. And by using recycled water, we are allowing our region and our communities to have that water, that accessible water for other essential uses, not just for firefighting, but also for businesses and types of activities. So with that tie, it does also allow for or contribute to local economic growth, right? Our users of recycled water are assured a continuous stream of high quality water. They are then able to continue for the businesses, continue to produce whatever widgets they might be producing. And maybe most importantly, as far as this is concerned, continue to employ our citizens in the region, and of course, contribute to tax bases and other economic activities within our area. So, the use of recycled water really does, I think, contribute to a strong local economy as well as anything else. Environmentally speaking, we are contributing quite a bit to avoidance of discharging out to the Santa Monica Bay. As a reminder, the city of Los Angeles Hyperion treatment plant discharges about 225 million gallons per day to the Santa Monica Bay. That's about 82 billion gallons a year. West Basin takes on average about 35 million gallons a day and recycles that. And so that's about 12 billion gallons of secondary effluent that we are preventing from discharging into Santa Monica Bay. And of course, I don't have to go too much in depth of the value of that to the environment. Greenhouse gas emissions, as you're well aware, imported supplies are delivered here from far, far away, whether it's Northern California or the Colorado River. And that contributes to greenhouse gases through the energy, the pumping necessary to deliver that water into our area. And using a local resource such as recycled water, we're reducing those greenhouse gases in order to pump up over the mountains and the Tehachapi's to get that water into our distribution pipes. And lastly, I think that the use of recycled water, one that is often overlooked is just simply the fact that most of our irrigation customers are able to continue irrigating because they're using a non-potable source during droughts and despite these challenging climate conditions. And so our children at schools and our parks and our dog parks are able to stay vibrant and green, and our communities, I think, benefit largely. So again, in the context of the cost of the recycled water specifically to West Basin, I want to make sure that we touched on these issues and reiterate the benefits that not just West Basin, but everyone receives from West Basin's use of recycled water. Next slide, please. So we have a couple of somewhat similar definitions that I wanted to reiterate. There's an entire list of definitions within the memo, hopefully to allow readers to discern what is some fairly detailed and in-depth information. But I did want to touch on these four in particular because there is some overlap in these definitions, and it's very easy to confuse one versus the other. So let's just go through them one at a time.
What page you on?
I am on page 4 of the presentation. Which one? 31 of the packet.
Thank you.
So operations and maintenance costs. I'll just read this definition for simplicity. Refers to the ongoing activities necessary to ensure a water treatment plant functions efficiently, reliably, and in compliance with regulatory standards. So essentially anything it takes to continue operating that facility on a day-to-day basis. And of course, this is in contrast to what we call capital costs. These are the expenditures incurred for acquiring, constructing, upgrading, replacing, or rehabilitating those physical assets that provide long-term value and utility to the water treatment system. And I think it's important for us to understand the distinction between these two, particularly as we start looking at volumetric costs versus fixed costs. Volumetric costs, when we refer to those, are often confused with operations and maintenance costs. But a volumetric cost is specifically the costs that are proportional to the amount of water produced, such as energy or chemicals. So those costs go up or down depending on how much water is actually produced through that facility. Now you compare this to what we call a fixed water cost. Fixed water costs are independent of the amount of water produced, such as labor or capital expenses. These are costs that we would incur or an entity would incur regardless of how much water is produced or whether any water is produced in some cases. Next slide, please. All right, I'll pause there before we get into the next area for any questions so far. All right. Well, you've seen this graphic, I'm sure, or some version of it many times. The purple pipes represent West Basin's tertiary disinfected or Title 22 purple pipe system. We have approximately 100 miles or more of pipe stretching through our service area and beyond. And of course, we've got 3 satellite facilities out within those purple pipe. We have the Edward C. Little facility, which is our flagship facility located in El Segundo. And of course, the pump station that we own and operate at the southwest corner of the Hyperion treatment plant. And so this graphic is really just to illustrate that the interconnectivity of our various facilities. So of course, all of the facilities begin, that water drop that they ultimately produce begins at the Hyperion pump station. That water is delivered into the Edward C. Little facility in the Star. Of course, from there is some treatment that happens. The bulk of our recycled water program is treated there. Our disinfected tertiary Title 22 treatment happens at Edward C. Little facility, as well as our barrier treatment process and our Chevron customers' boiler feed treatment happens at Edward C. Little as well. Now, while Chevron and barrier facilities go off to those customer uses, the disinfected tertiary system is what ultimately goes into those purple pipes. And of course, our other refinery customers at the Torrance Refining Company and Marathon, they actually start with water from the disinfected tertiary system to do some additional treatment before we send that water either as nitrified disinfected tertiary or as boiler feed for their uses. And so again, just wanting to remind the board of this interconnectivity, because if we go to the next slide, this is where the cost of service starts to get a little bit more complicated. Because of that interconnectivity I mentioned, and I didn't even mention the fact that at Edward C. Little, we have a solids handling system to handle any of the solids that we receive out of that secondary effluent that is shared by everybody. But the interconnectivity starts to make our calculation or our counting of costs a little more challenging. And so staff has gone through a significant exercise to make sure that we've got appropriate allocations of costs to the appropriate end use, I should say. And so in its simplest form, what you see here by the color is the fact that the Edward C. Little facility has one upstream feed water cost associated with it. However, the downstream remote satellite facilities such as Marathon or Torrance Refineries Company's facility, their feed water actually consists of that disinfected tertiary that I mentioned. And so the cost of service effort attempts to distinguish between, for each of our facilities, an upstream cost and the on-site cost. And by doing this, it allows us to get a little bit more granular in how we're distributing these costs. And as you can see graphically here in red, that represents the more or less the upstream costs that are associated with the Edward C. Little facility. And of course, again, that's the barrier, the Chevron boiler feed, NRG, and that disinfected tertiary or purple pipe system. And then, of course, at our satellite facilities, the upstream costs are not just the disinfected tertiary costs, but they are also the Hyperion pump station, the solids handling, the same shared costs that Edward C. Little has. And so staff has gone through a painstaking effort to really itemize and allocate the value of all of those upstream costs to each and every one of our treatment processes. We can go on to the next slide. In doing that, essentially, we've simplified this process to try to get it into a few cost centers. As an illustration here on this graphic, you see that the common cost sharing for the Edward C. Little facility is the source water costs through our partners with the City of Los Angeles, the conveyance of that water, which is largely pumping energy, solids handling costs that are associated with all of our treatment systems, and of course the Hyperion pump station infrastructure costs. Similarly, for the disinfected tertiary system, we've got the chemicals associated with that, the energy, fixed O&M, other utilities, and the infrastructure costs associated with disinfected tertiary. You can see on the right-hand side which customers benefit from these upstream costs. And so hopefully you're starting to see the picture that the distinction between the upstream costs and divvying that up between all of our downstream uses becomes important for this process. And so by doing that, we're going to be able to see what it costs to get water right to the fence line of one of our facilities. And then, of course, separately, what the cost is in the fence line of that facility. And then when we add them together, we have the entire cost of that particular water. Next slide. So I pretty much just covered this. You combine them together, you have a total volumetric cost associated with the recycled water. I would point out in gray there, we have the fixed O&M cost tied in there. And the word fixed obviously is from those definitions, very different than volumetric. You know, these are costs that are typically lumped into your operations cost. They do include labor, permits, and the reason that you see them here is because we have historically treated them as if they were a volumetric type cost. And so in this analysis, though, we reconsider whether that's appropriate, given the fact that the majority of these costs are incurred independent of that volumetric number. And so you'll see through, later in this presentation that we actually move those numbers out and lump them into a more of a fixed number. So we can go to the next slide. As I mentioned, if we just simply combine those upstream costs, what we ultimately have is a cost for each of our different treatment streams to get that feed water right to the fence line, to the start of the treatment process that is needed to deliver that fit for purpose type of water. And so throughout this table, this is the table that is within the memo that accompanies this presentation. And again, it really just attempts to look at solely the costs associated with delivering that water to the fence line of that end user. And so in total, we have approximately $28 million for fiscal year 2025. Probably a good time to remind the board that this memo is considering the 2025 fiscal year 2025 cost of service. And as such, when this was initially developed, these were budgeted numbers for 2025. And so what you're seeing here is essentially the budget that the board approved at the beginning of this fiscal year translated into those individual costs for each of the recycled waters. On the left-hand side there, you can see the sales volumes that we also budgeted for sales this year. And so by combining those two, we can determine that dollar per acre foot later in this presentation. We can go to the next. So as I mentioned, this distinction between upstream or feed water costs and on-site costs, the memo considers this. We take all those numbers from that previous slide and we can condense them into a singular feed water cost associated with each of the recycled waters. And then we look at those same cost centers of chemical, energy, other utilities that occur on site. So this would be, as an example, within the Chevron nitrified treatment plant, which you're well aware is about a mile away from the Edward C. Little facility. Well, now we've got the feed water cost associated with getting water right to that fence line. And then what you see is the on-site allocations. Those represent the costs that occur on the Chevron nitrified treatment plant facility before it gets distributed to Chevron. In total, upstream and downstream or on-site volumetric costs for this budget year were approximately $56 million. And we go to the next slide. Or actually, I think there's, yeah. So we'll come back to those volumetric or operations cost. Let's talk about infrastructure costs. These are the fixed costs associated with maintaining and improving the physical assets, including capital projects, R&R, and debt service. We do incur debt when we construct a facility or otherwise borrow money to invest in the capital needs of the facilities. And as a consequence, we've captured all of those into what we are calling infrastructure costs. So small capital replacements or R&R type purchases, when a valve goes out, it's a relatively small cost, but it can be capitalized generally. And that's a different scenario than, say, a large expansion or significant investment to modify the facility like a large capital project. We can go to the next slide. Same process. We go through a fairly large effort to ultimately assign value of any of that upstream or disinfected tertiary fixed costs or infrastructure costs to each of the facilities on a similar proportioning as we do for the O&M costs. That allows us to generate that upstream capital cost associated with disinfected tertiary or the Hyperion pump station. We also look at the specific needs of each facility and each treated water to generate that small capital, large capital, and debt service for a total from this budget year of about $50 million. Now, I think it's important to note here that you see a lot of round numbers in that small capital and capital project columns. And that's simply because, for budgeting purposes, we rely on historical costs associated with small capital, right? We know what we've spent generally the previous year, the previous 2 years, the previous 5 years. And so as we project ahead into the next budget year, we're relying on history to tell us what we may be spending in this coming year. So these are not exact numbers. And that's why you'll see a lot of very round numbers in these two. Similarly with capital projects, these are projects that we are intending to do in the future. And I would note that for capital projects, we currently have a 10-year capital plan. Instead of incurring or assuming the specific fiscal year 25 capital cost, which is frankly about $42 million all in total, what we've done is we've looked at a 10-year average, try to stabilize those costs a little more, those predictions. But the reality is it's very difficult to estimate a 10-year capital plan to exactness. And so, again, what you see in the capital projects column is really just an estimate of the monies that we would expect to spend on the infrastructure associated with each of these recycled waters in that given year. And it's a fairly round one. And then, of course, debt service, as the board is well aware, we have approximately $21 million in debt service each year. About 19 of that is actually applied to our recycled water program. And as a consequence, we can also go through and allocate how much of that debt is associated with each of the different treatment streams that we produce, for a total of about $50 million infrastructure upstream for total. Next slide. All right, we're almost there. So just wanted to highlight a few assumptions. We've made a number of them in this memo, and they are, I think, well documented. But some of the key ones for the purposes of this presentation and this summary, all in recycled waters, West Basin's recycled water program, including operations, maintenance, capital debt. The sum of those tables that you saw in previous slides is about $105 million. Again, that's some of those are operations numbers, which we can trust pretty readily, depending on how much water we produce. And some of those numbers are projections of spends that we may incur during the 2025 year. But all in total, $105 million. When we start to look at how to, what to do with this number, how to apply this number to each of our individual streams, while many of those rows in the previous columns represent a singular customer, the disinfected tertiary system actually has over 300 customers. It's easy to forget that West Basin has over 300 customers of recycled water, particularly because we often focus on those large users such as the refineries or the West Coast Basin barrier. But there are 300 customers. And so when we consider what we might do with this information or how it might relate to a rates setting process in the future, what this memo considers is just treating all of the costs associated with the disinfected tertiary system as if they were volumetric. And this would simplify the process of trying to identify for each of those 300 customers, some of which may be using only one acre foot a year, trying to assign a fixed cost in addition to a volumetric cost. So anyway, there's a lot of ways to skin this cat, but what I would say is in this memo, I just want you to understand that this memo considers as if all of the costs associated with disinfected tertiary were a volumetric cost for those downstream users. On-site fixed O&M can be considered a fixed cost. So I mentioned the fixed O&M that was identified as a volumetric cost previously. Again, these are costs that we will incur largely regardless of how much water, how much volume we produce. And so this cost of service effort actually takes that out of the volumetric category and places those into the fixed infrastructure costs. So because those are going to be the costs effectively that West Basin would incur independent of how much water is produced throughout the year. I've already touched on the small capital costs being an average of previous years, and I've touched on the capital costs, which are a projection of a 10-year average based on an existing capital investment plan. I would say at this point, though, that given today's current situation and future of West Basin's recycled water system, particularly with the opportunities associated with the Pure Water programs at Los Angeles and Pure Water SoCal through Metropolitan, staff in the coming year will be looking very closely at these assumptions that have historically been applied to the capital needs of the system and determining whether we need to make some modifications and changes to these costs. And if that's the case, very likely the costs associated with fiscal year 26, when we reproduce this document for 26, those costs may change from what we have today. Next slide, please. So all of this to say, to show this kind of blended table, it's the same information that you've seen in the previous slides. In this case, though, we took that feed water capital cost and put it into the volumetric category specifically for that disinfected tertiary and Hyperion pump station system. You'll note a bunch of zeros in the fixed O&M column, with the exception of disinfected tertiary. That's because for the other customers, we've taken those fixed O&M costs and we've applied them into the fixed category. However, because as the previous slide indicates, for disinfected tertiary's 300 customers, we feel it makes sense to just simply have a singular volumetric commodity rate that we would charge those customers. And so the fixed cost for disinfected tertiary system, just like the feed waters, the disinfected tertiary capital would remain in the volumetric. And so when you start blending these considerations, what we're looking at is a total volumetric cost of just over $60 million. Next slide. As I mentioned on the previous slide, those fixed O&M costs for our larger water users have been shifted for the purposes of this memo into the fixed cost structure. Again, it's really an effort to see a distinction between what the volumetric rate might be, or excuse me, volumetric cost might be relative to the cost that West Basin would incur independent of how much water is produced. And so that fixed O&M, nearly $10 million, is joined into the small capital projects and debt service for a total of 45. If you sum these two tables up, you still get that $105 million that I mentioned 2 slides ago, which do represent the totality of West Basin's recycled water program costs. All we've done here in these 2 tables compared to what I'd shown previously is really just move some of those columns around for simplicity's sake. Next slide, please. So why do we do all that, or why does it matter? Well, again, when we start talking about that volumetric cost, oftentimes for budgeting purposes, we want to talk about $1 per acre foot of water produced. And when we treat the numbers the way that we've treated them in the memo, you actually end up with a volumetric or commodity type cost as seen in this table. And you'll note, I think, and understand why, each of our recycled water streams has a different cost to produce $1 per acre foot. And that's simply because each and every facility is very different, has very different and unique operations associated with it. And so, of course, no one or 2 streams alike are going to have an identical cost. So treating it similarly for the cost, for the fixed water cost, as you saw on the previous slide, those are not divided by $1 per acre or by the amount of water produced. It's just a fixed cost, again, because it really doesn't matter how much water is produced that particular year. We anticipate incurring that same cost regardless of the water produced. So next slide, please. And here's a bit of the finality of it all. As you're well aware, many of our rates are set. They are either defined by contract with many of our customers or defined by the board each fiscal year through adoption of a rate. And I would note in this case, right in the center of the table there, instead of the singular disinfected tertiary, commercial irrigation and institutional customers, we do have 2 separate rates for that disinfected tertiary water. It's an inside the service area rate and an outside the service area rate. But for the purposes of this cost of service, the cost of service to produce that water is the same. The water molecules are exactly the same. And so ultimately what this is attempting to do is, again, show an estimate of the revenues associated with the current rates that we have in place, as well as that cost of service for fiscal year 25. And when we do that math, it reveals, which I don't think is a surprise to anyone, that the recycled water program is operated in a deficit, and that it requires some additional money beyond just the revenue that is generated through its sales to continue supporting that system. We can go to the next slide. So as EJ mentioned, we have, I don't think historically ever gotten into this level of detail and distinction between the individual costs of each of our recycled waters. Historically, I believe we have generally presented the board with a total cost for the recycled water, an average cost, if you will, but we haven't gotten into this level of depth. And so what are we going to do with this information now that we have it? Well, as I mentioned in one of the previous slides, first and foremost, we're going to go back to our capital improvement plan and update that and maybe recalibrate it based on today's assumptions and frankly, tomorrow's opportunities. And so that will be an effort unto itself, but staff will be looking at that in order to see what those true needs are under today's conditions. We are expecting to do to true this memo up. We've done this memo, as I mentioned, with budgeted numbers at the beginning of 2025. And as we start to get towards the end of 2025, we'll revisit this and actually take the actual spent numbers, apply those, and then we'll have a true cost of what the fiscal year 25 numbers were for that year. Similarly, we're going to use the same methodology and repeat this memo for not just fiscal year 26, but years to come. And that memo and that understanding of the cost of service for that particular fiscal year, I think will be considered as part of our budgeting process. And we'll actually be able to see how these numbers impact West Basin's overall budget and rate setting process. And of course, I just mentioned that we're going to factor that cost of service into the budgeting process and the rate setting. And then, of course, as you're well aware, many of our 25 or 30-year-old refinery agreements are coming up for renewal. And in this case, we're just looking to use this information to allow us to make some intelligent decisions in negotiating those next contracts. And so by having a good understanding and sharing that understanding with our partners in the refineries and our partners at WRD, we'll be able to, I think, have a better start to negotiations for pricing associated with those contracts. And with that, I believe that's the end of this presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. That was a very nice presentation, very comprehensive. At this point, any questions from the board?
I mean, move.
Okay, Director Gray, do you have any questions?
No, Mr. President, I'm going to listen to the conversation.
Director Deere? And I very much appreciate all of the work, and I think you did an excellent job of presenting an overview. Very thorough. I think there's a lot more information in the attached memorandum. I know we've had a lot of discussions about this, so I really appreciate it. Just for a point of clarification, the basis for the unit cost here is going back to the table on page 9, or I guess that would be page 36 to 46, is based on assumed sale.
That is correct. These are the numbers that were used in the 2025 budget for assumed sales and, of course, assumed revenue associated with 2025.
So I'm wondering if we can, you have now about 6 months of actual sales versus the assumed sales. And some of these numbers, I'm a little surprised. I would have thought some of them would have been a little higher than what we ended up budgeting. Can you, I think you can, but it'd be interesting to see if you took the information that's there and actually adjusted it based on actual sales for the first 6 months.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you can provide that to us, sometime in the near future here. Just to see, what the actual costs are based on real sales. We know that these are the actual costs, but based on projected sales for the entire year. So we can actually kind of, I would call it a normalization of costs based on actual 6 months act.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's an exercise we can certainly take on, and frankly, that is part of the process of starting to develop the 2026 estimation. So it really doesn't represent any additional work for staff.
So if you can do that and provide that to the board, I would really appreciate that. I don't know if any other board members have any other requests at this time. Otherwise, thank you very much. There's a lot of food for thought here. I know that we've been working on this for a very long time. Appreciate all of the effort that's gone into it. And I understand very much, as you all do, that it's a work in progress. But will allow us to make much better informed decisions in developing not only our budget, but our long-term needs. Thank you very much.
Mr. President,
Yes.
I do have maybe a question or two real quick. And one of them was, of course, earlier in the presentation, and I don't remember what slide it is I'm looking, but basically, I think you had the fixed cost of the infrastructure was about $50 million per year, right? I don't remember what page that was on. I'm looking for it.
Maybe thinking about page 12 of the presentation,
I think,
end of the packet.
yes, okay, yeah, that was the one. So just so we all understand, and this is based on 24-25 fiscal year, right? I think. But basically, if I'm reading it correctly, you're letting us know it costs about $50 million a year just for the infrastructure costs of the recycled water program. Am I interpreting that?
Yes, that's correct. Between the capital investments for the upstream facilities, the on-site facilities, and the debt service included for all of those facilities, we are estimating, and I would emphasize that word, estimating $50 million.
Okay, good. And I just, I think that this report is extremely timely and informational just for us to have a good grasp of how much it does cost us to produce these different water qualities and make some key decisions in the future. And you had noted later that, some of these, of course, are fixed costs. So regardless of how much or how little bit of water we're producing, we have to pay a certain amount of bills, right? But the one last thing I wanted to look at one more time was that last slide. I think it was the page 44 out of 46 of our packet, which had all the last column was in red. So I'm sure you know which one that is. I flipped to it real quick. But there's that comparison of fiscal year 25 rates and costs. Keep going back to the last chart. There we go. And I think this just explains what we've all known for a long time, right? That the recycled water program basically operates, in the red, right? At a deficit to the agency. And so, of course, you all have done a great job working with our staff and the consultants to map this out and really dive into how that water cost is calculated. This is like the most deep dive I think any of us has ever seen here. But I guess for not just the board, but our public to understand, I mean, we love recycled water, but it does come at a cost to the agency, right? We have not basically broken even over all these years with that particular set of programs. So I guess that's more of a comment, but it's also for us to understand and see it, in writing before us, what we are looking at And then when we think about the long-term, operations of our facility, which I know, again, we're very proud of, and we love that facility. The water community is very proud of it as a whole. But, these things do take a lot of costs. So anyway, I guess that's more of a comment than a question, but am I interpreting that right? Maybe, Mr. President?
You are interpreting it correctly. And, the recycled water program is subsidized by the potable water program to the tune of $45 million a year.
Mhm.
And if I could add some color,
Sure.
Director, it's, have to remember that many of these contracts that we have in place were developed 25, 30 years ago, and the cost estimates or the annual rate increases associated with those rates didn't necessarily tie to the cost increases that we've seen over the last 30 years. So of course, those have diverged a little bit in the revenue streams being based on one tracking and the costs going up. And all that to say that, these costs, I don't think they've always been this extensive. One of the things that was revealed by this process, I think, is going to allow us to really dig into our individual treatment costs and start to see where some perhaps low-hanging fruit or even high-hanging fruit for savings might be. And so we're going to be using these numbers to really dig in and see are there areas that we can save money on to get this red at least lower. But I was going to mention that in 2021, two things happened that I think had a significant impact on the amount of red we're seeing now. And that was, of course, COVID period. And as I'm sure you're well aware, the prices of many things, including chemicals, went up substantially during that period. But of course, you'll also remember that the Hyperion upset for our source water, which of course caused us to use more chemicals associated with the treatment at those higher prices. And so in the last 2 or 3 years alone, these costs are significantly higher than they had been historically. And so as we are starting to get our hands around this methodology for this cost of service, we're going to start taking a look backwards as well and seeing exactly where those cost increases were limited to, and maybe determine whether there's any savings to be had there. So there's quite a bit of information that we can use from this study to West Basin's benefit, not just those bullet points or those highlights that we touched on, but I think it's going to change, frankly, the way that we have costs and the way that we manage our recycled water system.
Ask a couple more questions.
You may, as you wish.
Good. No, thank you, Eric. I mean, and coming out of COVID and even the Hyperion upset situation, now some of those things have leveled off, though. Am I accurate that, yeah, we had a lot of supply chain issues and pricing went up that was completely beyond our control. I guess I'm understanding at this point that things have started to level back down a bit with some of the suppliers, maybe not everybody, but is it getting a little more normal out there at the moment?
I'll actually let Susanna, who's probably more familiar with those costs directly than I am.
Most of the chemical thing I think we reported previously has leveled out, but it has not gone back to.
Never went down.
I mean, the hypochlorite is one of the largest amount of chemical expenditures. That chemical has calmed down, but for most of the rest of the chemical pricing, we're pretty much staying above the COVID, pre-COVID.
Susanna, did it come down to the pre-COVID level? Came down, but didn't come down to what it was. So.
Yeah, and then not to mention like the inflation, factor into all this price increase. And yeah, we see that in consulting fees where rates have gone up significantly as well.
Right. Okay.
Director, if I could add,
Yeah, please.
I don't want to suggest that we had very flat costs up till 2021 and then significant increase. this is a good dot to connect, which is, I'm sure you recall many of our graphics where we show the water quality from Hyperion deteriorating over the last 30 years on a fairly gradual increase, specifically for things like solids or turbidity. And of course, our costs from day one have gone up. 2021 represented a big jump, but in general, from 2020 back into the 90s, that cost has consistently gone up because of the water quality, which is of course not just simply due to what they're doing at Hyperion, but rather effects of conservation, right? As people are conserving, the Hyperion secondary effluent becomes harder to treat, and there's larger solids that we see, and of course, all of that accumulates into 30 years into a recycled water program. It costs more than it did at year one.
I think I have two more thoughts real quick. And one of them is, now my understanding that you all have developed a new tool coming out of this, right? This is my understanding, so that you can plug different numbers and options in much more readily to create like hypothetical, projections. And is that right?
Yeah, I think what you're referring to would be the tool for the rate study. And I think we've been careful to make a distinction between this cost of service effort and that tool. But what that tool is going to allow us to do is to take these numbers and plug them in with METS rates, plug them in with our operating costs associated with other areas, not just recycled water, for the entire finances of the district, and ultimately come up with some long-term projections to allow us to support decision-making. And so that tool should allow us to not just focus on the recycled water, but to run some scenarios that would look at different rate increases that are necessary because of these costs.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then while you were speaking, I'm reminded, of course, that we are selling less potable water the last couple of years, which on the one hand, we're really proud of that. And we've changed our budgeting process to be more conservative on water sales at this time. But this district, I think, has done a great job to bring down demand for potable. And everyone sees it's very much reflected in our numbers, but it also is difficult financially for this district. So we got a lot on that side of the equation. Last but not least, and still looking kind of at this chart, because forgive me, but which one of these categories covers just like the basic outdoor irrigation water that we sell?
Sure. Right in the center of the graph or table there, you see DT, CII, inside service area and outside. You'll recall that our purple pipe extends beyond just our service area. We also sell recycled water, disinfected tertiary, to the city of Los Angeles, as well as to the city of Torrance. And so for the purposes of our rate structures, as shown there, there's a slightly different price for the outside service area customers than for the inside. And so your irrigation customers with inside the service area are right there at about 3,166 acre feet.
Okay. Because obviously we have a number of customers who utilize that water and enjoy that water. I do understand, a lot of times people approach me, and I'm sure the other directors, wondering how they could potentially get access to the recycled water for outdoor irrigation, including a lot of government folks, right? So cities and school districts, etc. But I do also know that some of these folks, as good hearted as their interest in, they don't quite understand the complications of that recycled water product to their facilities or properties. And of course, we are extremely realistic when I know staff talks to them about it. Of course, we would love to have more people on recycled water, but there is a cost to provide that water. And it may or may not work in their favor financially. It works in their favor when there's a drought or there's issues where potable is restricted. So I definitely, as we continue on in our discussions and conversations, I want to make sure that, you all continue to let us know that in some of your updates in our budget process. Because again, we get a number of requests asking us to look at these things. But I think there's some sticker shock when people get down to brass tacks, working with you all on what that potential situation is. I will say this, though, don't get me wrong. I mean, I would rather they be on recycle water in a lot of ways, because yes, we're selling that water, but it's sustainable. And it does add volume that we would be providing to communities rather than going out to the ocean. So, but again, big opportunity costs. I think that the public as a whole, while they embrace what we are doing, it's complicated on the price. And so, anyway, we all have to be very clear about how these things work. And you guys are doing this on behalf of the board. So I'll just say thank you for that. That's all I got for the moment, Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Houston. Very good comments. Okay, if there's no other comments, we will move on to our next item on the agenda, which is the closed session. We don't have any. And then director comments and agenda items. Director comments, general manager has a few announcements, so please make those.
Yes, thank you very much, President Alvarez. First and foremost, I wanted to give some very positive news. West Basin has been the recipient of a $250,000 grant from the Office of Emergency Services. And this grant does not require any in-kind or matching funds, so we're excited about that. It's the rare free money grant that's been offered. It is for California's or to partially fund efforts under California's cybersecurity plan. It would fund 4 specific projects: cybersecurity program assessment and development, disaster recovery and system acquisition, our .gov migration and identity management and infrastructure, and then security information and event management implementation. My understanding is that as part of our 2025 fiscal year budget, this would save us $80,000. The remaining funds would be utilized or would have been included in future budgets. So again, this will be specific cost savings measures. And so we will be working with our public information team to put out a press release next week. We've been focused primarily on the fires and providing information related to that. But we are very excited about this. Again, there are no matching funds required. And these are all programs and projects that we would have been requesting moving forward. So it'll be dollar for dollar cost reductions. Secondly, I wanted to inform the board that I've been in contact with our partner, Nina Charney, who's both the executive director of the West Basin Water Association, as well as the city councilwoman for the city of Manhattan Beach. She has been moved by obviously the impacts these fires have had on LA County, and has been leading an effort for donations within the South Bay community. She did ask if West Basin's Edward C. Little Water Recycling Facility could be utilized as a drop-off location for those donations. That event is still a work in progress. I know Daryl Ramos Young, sitting back here, has been going back and forth with the group as far as organizing that, but we anticipate that happening next week. It is intended to collect very specific items, and as soon as we get the marketing materials, we'll get that out to the board of directors, and we'll begin to utilize our social media platforms to promote that. And then last but not least, I wanted to inform the board that earlier this week I was notified by Los Angeles County. They are seeking some assistance for property tax relief for those impacted by the Franklin fire. Looking at the materials that they requested authority to do that. I did work with our legal counsel to get their approval. So I wanted to let you know that I did sign that utilizing general manager authority. The total impact, financial impact on West Basin is expected to be less than $3,000. And of course, I notified the board president, spoke with him earlier this week before signing that. So we have submitted that form. So there'll be a small impact, but hopefully for those that were impacted by the Franklin fire, which occurred back in December of 2024, hopefully they get some of the relief needed. I would expect that given the situation that we have now, something similar would happen next year. So we'll continue to work with our friends at the county to implement that. And Mr. President, that's all I have, unless there are any questions about any of those.
Is there any questions on that from any board members?
No question.
I have a couple of comments, regarding the property tax relief. That is the least we can do to reach out to folks who have lost their homes and so on. And you mentioned, general manager, about the current fire. Think that, when this comes up again, if it does exceed your, authority, you should bring it back to the board, but that would be very much in favor of also helping out, all, our areas, mostly impacted in Malibu, which is where we serve, where the fires have, had just a catastrophic effect, really sad situation. So, I think that, this is something that, relief that we can do. With respect to the drop-off site, I'm very pleased to hear that, the South Bay community are looking, to support, people that have lost their homes and everything. With respect to that, are the city, cooperating in this, or is this something that Manhattan Beach is leading? And then, the city hall itself, they, being also, activated as a potential drop-off site.
I believe it's being coordinated with the assistance of our cities. However, I don't believe that the other locations will be municipal locations. Appears to be primarily churches, along with the Eversey Little facility. Again, we have a lot more space. If you look at our parking lot on the east side, there's a great opportunity for people to be able to swing through, drop off. They're coordinating right now pods for the locations so that we'll have a place to store any items. But I would say that this is primarily through her leadership individually, and then a coordinated effort. I know that Manhattan Beach Chamber. So I don't know all the names of everybody, but it's a smaller group.
I guess that, I think it's a great idea, but, I would hope that, I'm thinking of a lot of, city halls that, and I'm looking at it, for example, Redondo Beach, very similar to Manhattan Beach, has underground parking. There is an awful lot of area where they can store materials, et cetera. And, I know there's a lot of people that would probably like to give, but it also helps them if they don't have to travel as far. So as we go further and further down into the peninsula, et cetera, some of those city halls can also accommodate drop-off. And I would, encourage you to, reach out to her and maybe have her look at all of the city halls and that they all also provide, drop-off facilities. It just makes it easier for somebody, that lives in Redondo or Torrance to drive to either Torrance City Hall, which actually has a lot of areas also where they can accommodate drop-off, or Redondo Beach City Hall versus driving all the way up together, et cetera. The more drop-off areas that we have, I think, the easier we'll make it for public to be able to provide some relief and drop-off, material.
I'll work with her.
All right, so that's it for comments on that. Director comments, do we have any?
I just want to say thank you to staff. I mean, this has been a long time in coming, so I really do appreciate it. And I know there's a lot of more in-depth material here in our packet, so do appreciate that. Also, that's really good news that EJ just shared with us, that grant. That's pretty incredible. And that was from the California Office of Emergency Management. Correct. Okay. All right. And we do know, and we talked about before, obviously cybersecurity is a big deal. All the water districts, including this one. So that's good news. And I echo what our president said about that relief, the Franklin fire, that we can offer. So thank you to General Manager. And of course, I'm glad that we can participate in this the donation drive that Nina Tarnay has kind of taken it upon herself to help lead. It's one of many different things, but even just having a chance to help out. And we're some residents that live near our area on the north side of South Bay. Can be a place to drop items. So thank you to everyone involved in that. That's all I have. Thank you, Mr. President.
Greg, do you have any comment?
There was a question about sponsorships that we had this last year. I talked to Susanna Medina, who's the chairperson of the Gardena Cinco de Mayo Scholarship Committee. And they had an application in, and they said they haven't heard from us. And that was some time ago, that they put an application in for contribution from us, and wondered if anyone's not heard about it or knows what happened to it. That's all I have.
Director Gray, do you have any closing comments?
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. I want to kind of reiterate what Director Houston said about the cost of studies, cost of service study. Thank you to staff. I know it was a long time coming and a lot of effort put into doing it. And so I appreciate the presentation this morning and all the discussion. Regarding the Charlie Wilson's organization having the event in the city of Inglewood, I want to thank Charlie for even doing that because most of the luncheons have been in other areas. So I do appreciate it. I know the cost was an issue, but I do appreciate the fact that they do want to come to this area to have their luncheon. So I did want to mention that, and thank you to everyone in terms of the efforts relative to the fire. And thank you, staff, again this morning for your presentation. Thank you, Mr. President.
All right, well, I do not have any further comments, so this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.